Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm Bob Hornstein, and I'm the Director of Community Relations and Public Affairs for the Jewish Federation of Greater Portland. Today's program is sponsored by the Federation's Jewish Community Relations Council, or JCRC, which is chaired by Michelle Bombet-Minch. For those of you who are not familiar with the work of the JCRC, much of which is done in an interfaith context, we focus largely on protecting the social safety net, addressing homelessness, combating anti-Semitism and hate and bigotry in all forms, promoting awareness about the threat of climate change, and also, of course, strengthening local ties to the State of Israel. As a 501c3, we cannot endorse political candidates, but we hold these types of forums so that you, the listeners, can hear where the candidates stand on issues of importance both to our community and to the public at large. And I want you to know that we did invite other Republican candidates, but unfortunately, none of them responded to our request. But the good news is that we have a full hour with former House Minority Leader and Representative Christine Drazan. So we'll look forward to that conversation in just a moment. Just some logistics. The chat function will be disabled. So if you have a question, you can use the Q&A function. We ask that you ask your questions respectfully and also that you hold your questions until the bottom of the hour. Our Legislative Advocacy Committee has prepared some questions in advance, and you might find that your issues have already been covered. So please, if you can, wait till the bottom of the hour to submit your questions. With that, I'm going to introduce our moderator for today's conversation. That's Hank Kaplan. And Hank is the Vice Chair of the Jewish Community Relations Council. He's also a member of the Federation Board and the Chair of our Legislative Advocacy Committee. So Hank, it's all yours now.
Thank you, Bob. And welcome everyone to the last in our primary series of gubernatorial candidates. The governorship, of course, is the most important of our statewide, four statewide elected offices in Oregon. Over the past 30 years, we have had 4 Democratic governors: Kate Brown, John Sanford, Ted Kulongoski, and Barbara Roberts. Today, we are visiting with Christine Drazan, who hopes to end that Democratic streak and reclaim the governorship for the Republican Party. The Jewish Federation is, of course, nonpartisan, and we do not endorse any candidates for office. Those of you who missed our previous forums with Tina Kotek, Tobias Reed, and Betsy Johnson can check out the recorded sessions on the Jewish Federation website, which you would find at www.jewishportland.org. We do hope to have another forum after the primaries for the remaining candidates for the general election in November. So our format today will be to spend about an hour with former Representative Drazan. We have prepared several questions, but if you have additional questions, as Bob indicated, that you'd like to ask us to ask the candidate, please put them in the Q&A. But later in the hour, and please understand that given the short span of time, we don't expect to get to everyone's questions. So first, let me tell you a bit about our guest today. In the 1990s, Christine Drazan worked as Chief of Staff to former Oregon House Majority Leader and Speaker of the House, Mark Simmons. Prior to seeking elected office, she served as Executive Director of the nonprofit Cultural Advocacy Coalition. She was elected to the Oregon House representing the Canby area in 2019, and during her very first term in the legislature, was selected to replace Carl Wilson as the House Minority Leader. She resigned from that position only recently to pursue her run for governorship. So thank you again, Ms. Drazan, for being with us. For the next 10 minutes, we'd like you, or however long you want to take, please tell us a couple of, generally, what are the primary things that you hope to accomplish as governor? And also, how will you deal with the toxic divisions, not just Republican, Democrat, but also rural, urban, that seem to be hampering the effective governance of our state?
So thank you for that introduction, Hank, and thanks everyone for joining us today. It is a pleasure to be with you, and having the whole hour to myself, I feel a tiny bit selfish with that. I would have been more than happy to share it with any of my other Republican colleagues that are running for this office, but I do look forward to having this conversation with you guys today. My priorities for Oregonians in this race are really pretty simple and basic. I believe that there's an extraordinary opportunity in this upcoming election cycle to really do everything we can to improve the quality of life for the people of the state. From my side of the aisle, that focus will be a range of issues from community safety all the way through to schools, and certainly homelessness is a critical issue. I believe that what we have had for far too long, as Hank indicated, with single party control, in particular of the executive branch, has been an inclination to exacerbate the rural-urban divide and to leave people behind in the state, because the constituencies have primarily been on one side of the aisle that have been best served by single party control in the last decade. This election is an opportunity to really develop some muscle memory for Oregonians moving forward in our state. I believe that, to Hank's point, that part of what we faced with the divisions that our state has been experiencing have had more to do with the fact that there hasn't been the necessity of compromise. There hasn't been the necessity of consensus building or collaboration in the same way. With single party control, you really have sort of a narrow range that you really do have to operate within, because politics is driven by simple math. You have to get 31 and 16 on the governor's signature. And having a Republican governor brings other voices, other interests, other impacts forward to be able to get to that last governor's signature. Had we had that, had we had balanced government, I believe that the divisions that we've been seeing and experiencing would not be as pronounced as they are right now. I believe that much of it is really the consequence of having this really dramatic imbalance in perspectives. And so this year in particular, the way that you bridge those divides is to have true balance. And you have true balance on the other side of our elections by actually choosing a new direction and a new path and a new perspective. I don't believe that the problems that we've been facing in recent years will be solved by more of the same. I think that we will see a doubling down of approach, and that will not bring the most creativity and, frankly, the most kind of innovation to the problems facing us. Homelessness in particular, which was mentioned in the opening by Bob, that challenge for us has been ongoing nationwide. I can still remember in 2010 when President Obama was talking about homelessness and saying that within 3 years, he was going to end homelessness for all of our veterans across the nation. And then within 5 years, he was going to end homelessness for all women and children and young families. And that was going to be done through a housing first approach. And while that approach has made gains and it has been an important piece of the puzzle, I think what we've found in particular here in Oregon is that homelessness is a challenge that's unique to each person in that circumstance. And that the response that we provide needs to be more holistic, more focused, and in particularly driven by an approach that's more case management than necessarily an anonymous kind of overarching policy approach. The legislature has invested $1.7 million, and that's just in about the last 18 months or less, in issues around homelessness and housing. So you have, and just to kind of lay out what that includes, it includes some funding for landlords when we had the rental eviction moratoriums. It includes supports to keep people in their homes. It includes low-income housing supports, of course, and homelessness supports, and wraparound services, supports for second home program, things like that. And it also included, of course, the turnkey program and the tiny homes. And so there has been deep investments made at a state level, and I know that those have also been doubled down and layered at a local level as well. And we're beginning to address the need for shelter. But that's not necessarily the same idea is changing our approach and our mindset toward homelessness. Homelessness should be, I hope, viewed as a society as something that is rare and temporary, not that it is ongoing and chronic. And I don't believe that we're going to get to the mindset that we view homelessness as rare and temporary unless we're willing to see those people that are in those circumstances as individuals. And I know that, in particular, I'm from Clackamas County. That's where I was elected to serve. Clackamas County has signed on, and I think Washington County has too, with this approach that's called Built for Zero. And that approach is a person by person analysis of who in real time is experiencing homelessness in a given region or community. And then you're able to follow their progress through the progression from potentially being unsheltered to receiving services and getting into either transitional housing, shelter housing, or long-term housing, or supportive environment. And so all of that, I think, only happens on an individual basis. You can't say our point in time count for homelessness is 14,000 people. We're going to build 14,000 units and that's going to resolve the problem. For some people, it really is a direct line between a loss of housing, an event that happened in their lives, domestic violence, loss of a job, any number of issues can create that trigger. But then after that, a lot of things pile on that then require additional interventions if you're very serious about transitioning someone to long-term success. And so I believe that that is the approach and the focus we need to take as a state. But in addition to all of those deep commitments and connections to the people, our fellow neighbors that are in that position right now, we have got to give our local communities the ability to enforce existing statutes and ordinances and provide help, provide assistance. Remember that our safety net is strong, and our safety net is not at risk. It's very strong right now. We need to get people into that safety net. And then we need to come back to this mindset that we don't accept homelessness as permanent, ongoing, and chronic. We help people. And that makes homelessness temporary, and that makes homelessness rare. And then our streets are passable, and our parks are usable again by kids and communities. And that is not assumed to be the place that people in greatest need remain. And so I just wanted to touch on that one first. I'm deeply committed to restoring our standards in our education community in particular, restoring graduation rates, and committing to have summer school, additional interventions for our students, testing to better understand exactly where our kids need additional supports, and then providing those supports in the classroom to make sure that they can succeed and achieve, and then pursue whatever their best future for themselves might be. So for me, education, community safety and quality of life are some of the key issues. And that certainly includes affordability, which continues to be a major driver. There's certainly federal issues at play there, but here in the state of Oregon, we have a regulatory environment and a tax environment that continues to drive up, in particular, affordability issues here in the state of Oregon, where we're one of the most expensive places to live in the nation. And the benefits and the services that we see on the other side of those costs and expenses are not necessarily equivalent to the burden. And so we need to, as a government, provide more return on those tax dollars to Oregonians and do everything we can to remember that government is there to kind of level the playing field, ease the pathway, provide the safety net, educate our students, and then let people live their own lives and make their own choices for themselves. I feel like I've well exceeded my 10 minutes. And so go ahead and start waving at me, Hank. I'm happy to take questions.
That's fine. Thank you very much. And actually, homelessness, which you already spoke about at length, is one of the first topics that I wanted to ask you about. I have some specific questions. You talked about affordability. What specific steps would you take as governor to encourage the development of more affordable housing? And related to that, are there parts of our land use policies, such as local inclusionary zoning rules, that can be changed to accommodate the production of more housing? And what are your plans specifically for helping the Portland metro area with the homeless crisis?
Yeah, so that was a lot of questions all mixed in together. So I'm going to start with affordable housing, which I think is a really interesting and complex issue. So in the areas, in particular in the metro parts of our state and some of the high growth parts of our state, we see affordability as as the biggest barrier to home ownership. And of course, it's the biggest barrier to growing our workforce and bringing people into our state and providing the kind of folks, the workforce that we need to continue to grow our economy. And in some ways, that challenge has been, we have to take responsibility for where we are. Land use plays a part, system development charges plays a part, property taxes play a part. Each bit layers on and adds expenses and makes it less and less affordable for people to either be able to rent or own. And you untangle that by having that opportunity for every level of government to take some responsibility to unwind some of the regulatory burden and to streamline some of these processes. I mean, I have heard from folks that talk about the permitting process that's itself taking 18 months. And over the course of that time, materials costs go up, labor costs go up, everything drives up the costs of these particular projects. Inclusionary zoning in particular in Portland is one of those ideas that, from the statistics I have seen, was intended to force a policy decision into some of those developments, but instead has resulted in those developments, like not proceeding as people try to figure out how to make those projects pencil. And so it's one of those well-intentioned ideas that I don't think has resulted in the outcomes that were promised with the concept of inclusionary zoning. And for some parts of the state, when I'm out in the Eastern Oregon, so talk about, I think you're focusing on Portland, but in the more rural parts of the state, all they have is affordable housing. And they have a hard time getting people to come and want to move there when their housing stock doesn't have the full range of options available to people. And they're competing with beautiful new homes over the state line in Idaho, where people can commute into Oregon. And if you live on the Oregon side, the home was built in 1970s and it's been Section 8 all these years, and they don't have the kind of housing stock that they would like. They would like the full range of housing in some of these parts of the state. And primarily what they have is low wage, low income, affordable housing. And it's draining the kinds of populations that they would like to see to sort of move to the more rural parts of our state and build businesses and raise their families. And it also impacts their tax base, services. So it's a different challenge at different parts of the state. Affordability in the metro area is a huge issue, as it is in Central Oregon, but in some of the other parts of the state, it's not the challenge you might think. It's actually the opposite, where they'd like to see builders building a broader range of housing.
Thank you. I have just one more question on this topic, then we can move to the next. Do you feel that the statewide rent control law is helpful in dealing with the housing shortage?
I haven't seen it be helpful yet. I mean, we went through COVID, right? It was instituted, and then we went through COVID, and you really had the rental eviction moratoriums, and lots and lots and lots of folks weren't paying rent at all. And so, landlords were sort of viewed as needing to just provide this public benefit to everyone because they were sort of in the housing business. I did not support the rent control bill, and I did not support it because I did not think that it was the right approach. I believe in free markets. And so I think within those free markets, I think that we need to provide greater housing stock, and we need to provide more options, and that's the best way to hold down costs, and not to put in artificial controls.
Thank you. Our next topic concerns anti-Semitism. Oregon, unfortunately, has a rich history of racism and anti-Semitism. Recent data shows that Jews are consistently the most targeted religious community in the United States. Anti-Semitic incidents are being reported at record levels. For example, in 2020, the Anti-Defamation League tabulated 2,024 reported anti-Semitic incidents throughout the country, which was the third highest year on record since they began tracking this in 1979. Mm-hmm. Jewish institutions are vulnerable targets. Our Portland community has made enormous investments in institutional security in the past few years. Those investments seem essential considering some of the recent history of attacks on houses of worship. In 2020, reported anti-Semitic incidents at Jewish institutions saw an increase of 40% from 2019. And just recently, we've seen a spate of local attacks by one individual on both Jewish and Muslim targets. So my questions are, first of all, how would you counter hate crimes and hate speech directed against religious minorities? And what sort of safeguards would you advocate to combat hate directed towards marginalized groups? And what steps might you take to be an ally and a partner of the Jewish community around security issues?
Yeah, I would do everything I could to ensure that the Jewish community feels safe and protected, and that existing hate crime laws are fully enforced. No one should have to endure being targeted for their religious beliefs, their faith, their heritage. And I absolutely would do everything I could to stand with the Jewish community in opposition to all of that. Those statistics are horrifying.
Okay, let's talk about Israel a little bit. Our community is very interested in cultivating a strong relationship with Israel. Do you believe that Oregon could benefit from collaboration with the state of Israel in areas of common interest such as water, agriculture, high tech, biotech, and cybersecurity? And if so, what would you do as governor to encourage a formalized partnership with Israel?
Yeah, I think that that's a really interesting question. I think that opportunities to be able to better understand what's out there for possible collaboration would be something I'd be very open to. I know that you guys, the Jewish Federation in particular, is really aware and trying to increase that level of collaboration, that level of partnership with Israel. And I'd be open to that. I would have some exploration to do, some better understanding of what opportunities present themselves. But I would absolutely be open to that.
Another question, are you familiar with the movement for boycott, divestment, and sanctions against Israel? And what is your perspective on it?
I'm not familiar with that. What's
Okay.
up?
Well, there is a movement primarily on college campuses to disinvest from Israeli companies and boycott Israeli companies or Israeli products. And have sanctions against Israel. It's a fairly significant presence on college campuses, not so much outside of college campuses. That's what. So let's move on to climate then. After, as I'm sure you recall, after the cap and trade efforts failed in the Senate a couple of years ago, Governor Brown issued the Oregon Climate Action Plan, OCAP, which set new greenhouse gas reduction targets and directed state agencies to incorporate climate protections into their agency planning and programs. What are your thoughts on Governor Brown's Oregon Climate Action Plan, and what, if anything, would you keep or change?
Yeah, I do not support her executive orders that she instituted on the Oregon Climate Action Plan. We have existing targets in Oregon law, and those targets were arrived at in the appropriate fashion through a legislative process. And her decision to go outside of the legislative process when the adoption of California's cap and trade program could not be moved through the process, and then her decision to institute her own version of that through executive order, I do not support, and I do not believe it was the right approach. We currently have clean fuels. We currently have 100% green standards. We are moving in the direction that I believe Oregonians support, but I do not believe that her approach out of her office as a singular administrative overlay on top of everything else that we're already doing was appropriate. When we talk about affordability, when we talk about cost drivers, when we talk about housing affordability, in particular, the new standards that were put in place around housing and the codes that were put in place around housing, just one item, just the new HVAC system for one 2,000 square foot house was a cost of $8,000. So I met with home builders and I said, what are you guys working on? What are you guys proposing to help address housing affordability? And they said that the governor's new rules will increase costs for HVAC systems for an individual house by $8,000. I think that when we talk about these issues, when we approach these issues, it has got to be to balance out interests, and it has got to be an appropriate response within what our intended public policy goals are. And in some cases, and in particular in this case, she has gone well and above, well and beyond what she should have within the scope of the authority of her office.
So how would you balance between protecting the climate and protecting jobs when the decisions impact both the environment and labor groups?
Yeah, we have an opportunity in particular in Oregon to continue to be on the cutting edge of renewable natural gas and bio and all of those things, including NuScale and nuclear. And Oregon actually is an innovator when it comes to green energy, whether or not it's offshore wind, or whether or not it's solar or whatever that might be. Oregon companies across the state right now are innovating. Even, carbon sequestration efforts are underway. We really do have a strong and growing sector in Oregon, in particular focused on issues around climate. And so from my perspective, the way that you approach climate is you don't build a bridge that leads to nowhere, where you just drop off of a cliff. And when you reverse engineer things and you say, we're going to artificially create a public policy that says we're going to cut our state off at the legs on date certain, regardless of whether or not the technology is there to let you achieve those goals, that's what drives costs. That's what has unintended consequences. But when we encourage and incentivize this innovation, then it will be available. There will be a market for it, and we can transition to that. And so I think that the best way to approach it is through a market-driven approach. And we're getting there, and we're going to continue to get there. But I don't believe that artificial deadlines and artificial policies at a state level are the way to approach it. I've always looked at these issues and supported federal level policies that really do create an even playing field across all the various states. A lot of the public testimony that we got when we were hearing the cap and trade bill in particular was that people, would avoid Oregon's regulatory environment and just move their efforts to another state. To the extent that they could, they would just move. And when you have a nationwide policy on this, you don't have those same challenges.
Thank you. One more question on related to the environment. As we see an increase in forest fires across the West Coast, what preventative actions would you take as governor to curtail and control this problem?
I'm sorry, you cut out. It might have been mine. Can you repeat that?
Yes, as we see an increase in forest fires across the West Coast, what preventive actions would you take as governor to address that problem?
Yeah, in the most recent legislative session, the long session, there was an opportunity to pass bipartisan legislation specifically around response to wildfire. That legislation included deeper investments in the side of it that's the firefighting side. And it certainly also included a new regulatory overlay for resilience and prevention. I think that legislation was an appropriate first step in relation to what are we going to do about wildfires. But certainly there's also a need to identify fires and suppress fires before they become mega fires, before they begin to endanger private property and the lives of Oregonians. And we do need to continue to work with our federal partners and our congressional delegation to continue to move forward the conversation about management of federal forest lands. 50% of Oregon's land is covered in trees. And that puts us at a particular risk when it is fire season here. And in the 2020 fires, when we had 1 million acres burn, the emissions from those fires was the equivalent to an entire year of people in Portland driving their cars around on the highways. We need to do everything we can to reduce the fuels that are on our landscape, while at the same time managing our resource in a way that is responsible and sustainable long-term. And we do that by taking a holistic approach that's both management of the forests and resilience and efforts to suppress and also efforts to prevent.
Many in our audience are concerned about the likely reversal of Roe versus Wade and what, if any, impact this may have on a woman's right to choose in this state. We know that Oregon has its own laws protecting the right to choose here, but we are interested in whether, as governor, you would seek changes in that state law, and if so, what sort of changes you might have in mind.
Yeah, thank you. The governor is certainly not a state legislator. And as you mentioned, every bit of Roe v. Wade is existing Oregon statute. Oregon has fully publicly funded abortions. We have abortions up to the time of birth. We have abortion protections in Oregon law. And so Oregon is one of the most accessible states in the nation for access to abortion. I am a pro-life woman. I always have been. And for me, that is a part of my personal value set. It's part of my personal faith. I'm a mom of 3, and I take that part of my own commitment to life very seriously. I'm opposed to the death penalty, and I'm a pro-life woman. And so what that means is if a bill came to my desk, I would sign it. But I also recognize that as we go through this process, that the issues that Oregonians are asking us to address are issues around quality of life, issues around schools, community safety, homelessness, and that this issue of Roe v. Wade is properly a legislative matter and is not a matter for the executive branch.
Thank you. Next, I'd like to switch to talking about substance abuse. The National Survey on Drug Use and Health, conducted by a subdivision of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, shows that Oregon now ranks 2nd in the country for substance use disorder, with 18% of the population suffering from addiction to alcohol and/or drugs, while at the same time, Oregon has fallen to 50th in access to treatment for that 18% of Oregonians who need it. What do you envision as Oregon's strategic plan to end our addiction crisis?
Yeah, we actually have had, really strong and excellent recommendations on this category from folks that serve these populations, and the bulk of those recommendations were not implemented in the years following their release. And I would certainly work with the recovery community to do everything I can to increase access, support workforce, get people into recovery, and provide the supports that they need long-term to stay in recovery, lifelong recovery. And I know, it sounds like you went through the same briefing, it sounds like I did. And that was shocking to me to learn that 18% of Oregonians age 12 and above face challenges with substance use disorder. And their recommendations to me, it was interesting. They said, we don't need program changes. They said, we need systems changes. And I take that to heart. The recovery community's request was that they have a point person in the governor's office that would take the lead and kind of raise their hand and be responsible to see that reimbursement rates, that parity is actually fully implemented, and that there isn't a barrier for access, and that people who are in this sector are actually paid appropriately for reimbursement rates for the services they provide. Right now, in particular, if you try to get someone into counseling or support right now, the wait list is ridiculous. And what people need is help when they need it. And we don't have the reimbursement structure that's being implemented to be able to allow that to happen. We don't have people in the pipeline as quickly as we need to be. So we have real work to do in this category. And I absolutely view this as a top priority.
Yes, one of the things that I think that we're seeing both with this crisis and the homeless crisis is a serious lack of people willing to do that work. That is social workers and counselors and so on, and that impacts all aspects of the social safety net, which you talked about quite a bit. Let me just ask you a little more broadly about that. Social research has found that social determinants of health include stable housing, access to food, access to healthcare, and assistance in navigating the healthcare and other systems. But unfortunately, many low-income people, and particularly minorities and people of color, are impacted by the absence of these determinants and have higher levels of illness and mortality as a result. And of course, their access to services is impaired by the shortage of people willing to perform those services. What strategies would you undertake if you're a governor to improve those outcomes and expand the availability of social services generally?
You know, this question is interesting because, I mean, I know you're aware of this, but we have coordinated care organizations, which we have had, which have morphed into various versions since the Oregon Health Plan was really undertaken by Governor Kitzhaber all those years ago. But Oregon's latest iteration of coordinated care organizations serving our low-income populations in the state they have the directive to address social determinants of health. They have the flexibility within their funding models to help support people on the Oregon Health Plan, including access to some of the issues that you indicated that are actually more reflective of the social determinants of health than necessarily just their annual checkup, or just having access to a doctor when they have a cold. And so that is built into our system right now. And it is relatively new. It's a relatively new addition to the CCO model. But my understanding in conversations with coordinated care organizations across the state is that they have had some success working with their local partners in supporting those issues for the populations that they're responsible for, and that the social determinants of health side allows the local CCOs to coordinate more closely with other nonprofits throughout the communities. And they're making it sound like there's some success there.
Thank you. Let me ask you a question about gun violence. There have been several initiative petitions circulating on the topic of gun violence. One of them, IP17, involves a permit requirement to purchase a firearm combined with restrictions on certain types of ammunition and large magazines. Another, IP18, restricts the manufacture and sale of semi-automatic assault weapons. Do you support either of these measures, or perhaps other legislation to curb the spread of gun violence in our state?
No, I don't. I think that where we are facing issues with gun violence in our state, that we need to enforce existing laws. And that, what we're talking about in so many of these cases are all of these other surrounding issues that impact a person's life, for whether or not you get to that point where you're engaging in criminal behavior. I mean, we're talking about preventing criminal behavior. And what we don't want to harm another person through any means at all, and intervening there, providing the social safety net, intervening, providing mental health supports, providing a stronger access to substance use disorder and recovery services. All of these things help build and strengthen the fabric of our community in a way that's much more effective from my perspective than just additional gun laws. I think that the root of the problem here is that we're broken in a lot of ways as humans. And what we need to continue to do is to care for each other, intervene, and provide the supports that are needed when they're needed.
Thank you. Several Jewish community relations councils around the state have been advocating for programs in schools that address anti-Semitism, racism, and all types of bigotry and discrimination. Our own JCRC was very active in advocating for and getting past the bill requiring Holocaust and genocide education in all Oregon schools. What are your thoughts about these sorts of programs?
I think they're good. I think the kinds of programs that help our students, better understand the impacts of that level of, I don't know, it's another one of those things that the more we can do to help our kids grow into the human beings that have a full understanding of what it means to be responsible to each other as a community, and don't have the same kind of barriers where they're judging each other and harming each other, I think all of that is necessary. So congratulations as well on getting your bill passed.
Thank you. So one of the questions in the chat relates to same-sex marriage. Obviously, there's the concern with the court about to overturn Roe versus Wade, what's next? And one of the concerns is the recent, not so recent anymore, but within the past decade decision about same-sex marriage, and of course, Oregon doesn't necessarily have to follow whatever the Supreme Court says on same-sex marriage, but presumably, if the Supreme Court were to act, that would become an issue in Oregon politics as well. What is your position on the right to on same-sex marriage in Oregon?
I just don't think that this is going to be an issue anywhere. I don't think that this is an issue that is going to move through the courts. I don't think it's an issue that's going to come up in Oregon. I think this is the ultimate red herring. I don't think that this will ever be, I don't think this will ever be reversed. I don't think this is ever at risk. And it's certainly not at risk with me. But I think for people who talk about this, I mean, I don't think it's real. I mean, maybe I'm completely misunderstanding the situation, but I don't think it's real.
Okay. So we have a few questions in the chat that kind of relate to the relationship between the Oregon Republican Party and former President Trump's expectations of loyalty from Republican state level officials, and the claims that the 2020 election were stolen. I guess, what are your thoughts about the internal schism in the Republican Party between those who demand loyalty to our former president and others?
So I am running for the Republican nomination, which means I would like to be able to be the nominee on behalf of my own party. I've been a Republican since I was, in my 20s. I was raised in a household that believed all politicians were rotten, except for Ronald Reagan. And so at that point, what do? You're raised a Republican at that point. And I have always believed that it's my commitment and my value set to do everything I can to engage in our public life and to fight and support, the greatest good for the greatest number of people. I don't think parties are about one person. There are these principles that are opportunity and equality and fairness and free markets that are the principles of the party that I have chosen to align myself with. And that is why I became a Republican. I grew up in a household also that was poor. I don't think we use that word anymore, but it meant that I value hard work and I relied on opportunity to be able to build a life. And to me, those are Republican principles. And so, whether or not the Republican Party itself is trying to figure out what the future holds and who's a part of that future, all I can tell you is that I'm committed to standing up for Oregonians, and I want to be a part of representing the ideals that I'm talking about and sharing with Oregonians from the leadership position in the governor's office, so that I can improve the quality of life of all Oregonians. I'm not running for Congress. I'm not running to go serve in Washington, D.C. I am running to be a part of Oregon's civic life here locally. And I'm committed to continuing to have those conversations and invite everybody in who wants to be a part of doing right by Oregonians and improving our quality of life for everybody.
So another question is, how would you distinguish yourself from other Republican candidates? That is, what makes you better qualified than the rest of the field, other than the fact, of course, that you're going to come talk to our community and the others weren't? What else distinguishes you as the most qualified in your field of candidates?
Yeah, I am the only candidate running that has the depth of experience that inside of public service, whether or not that was being a staff person in my 20s to Republicans when they have majority control, or more recently being elected and being the House Republican leader. I was kind of toe to toe and eyeball to eyeball with every bit of our most recent challenges. And I know how difficult it was to move through COVID and what it took to respond to some of the racial justice issues that our nation was facing, and what it meant to, transition through the conversations that, broke down our civic discourse inside Salem and how to recover from that. I have been in the fight, and I have kind of, a proven leadership perspective, where I'm pretty certain what my temperament's about and what my character is about, and other folks that are in the race have some strong opinions, but they really have no idea how that would actually be when they had the opportunity to actually need to make some of these decisions.
So we're actually kind of running out of questions for you, but I do have a follow-up question about the anti-bias programming at schools. Part of the pushback on these programs is that there isn't enough funding or resources, or that the school districts, are already short of funding, and this drains resources that could be used for other purposes. Would you provide increased funding for education to support these programs?
You guys, I proposed full funding for schools last time. I didn't support the commercial activities tax, to be clear, and there's a couple reasons for that. I did not believe it was the right revenue mechanism, and I didn't like the fact that it didn't just go into general fund. They nitpicked, and they said, you're going to get this money if you do this program, you're going to get this money if you do this program. And I believe in local control, and I think our school boards can make these decisions. So for a lot of reasons, I didn't support that. But when we got into our long session in 2021, when it was time to balance the budget, I pushed for full funding for our schools, especially on the other side of COVID. And not just for these programs like the ones you're talking about, but because I really believe strongly that teachers and intervention specialists and others really needed access to the full range of tools to be able to support students coming out of that experience. I had a middle schooler that I felt like was never going to recover from what distance learning looked like at our house. And I really do believe that education makes all the difference. It did in my life. It does in other students' lives. It is a core value, and it makes a difference for our future. So I supported that. I didn't get anywhere, but I tried. I fought the fight.
So we have another question about the movement in Eastern Oregon to join Idaho.
Oh gosh.
I don't know if you've spoken about that or have a position on that or thought about that issue, but perhaps you could share with us your perspective, or for that matter, the perspective of those Oregonians who want to split the state up.
So I think I'm originally from Klamath Falls. And so, part of my perspective on environment is from being in a community that was left behind when the environmental movement shifted, and there was no replacement for what that community became. They just, kind of devolved. And that impacts families and people and all those things. Well, the people that are now talking about the greater Idaho movement are feeling so separated from the fabric of the rest of the state that they feel disrespected, they feel like there's no opportunity, they don't feel heard. All those things, to me, are a failure of leadership in our state to recognize the diversity of our state and really truly respect people with different experiences and different requirements for where they live. I don't want anyone to leave Oregon and become a part of another state. But the people that are pushing for that, it's a moment of desperation for them, that they are convinced that they will never be able to actually have the lives that they hope for their families as long as they're tied to Oregon. And I want to do what I can to change their minds.
Thank you. We only have a few minutes left, and I want to be respectful of everyone's time. Do you have some, are there aspects of your positions that we haven't asked about that you think that we should know about? Are there other things that you think we should know about this race generally? I'll open up to any additional thoughts that you might have.
So thank you for the opportunity to speak with everybody today. I really, really value it and appreciate it. And I appreciate the work of the Jewish Federation and value the Jewish community in Oregon. And so thank you for this opportunity today. I want to serve our state. I guess that's the one thing I want you guys to know about me as a person. is that I am committed to doing my part, whatever that might be, to try to make things better for people. And I look at public policy through this lens of, does it help somebody or does it hurt somebody? And my first standard and my first commitment is to my fellow Oregonians. You know, I'm an Oregonian first, I'm a Republican second. And I hope that that is something that comes across as we go through this process of having this kind of dialogue about what the future of leadership looks like in our state. And so I think that when we talk about all these other various policies out there, that's probably the lens through which I look at everything. And so that's the way, that's my first issue that I evaluate, is how will this structurally play out for people? Not what's the bumper sticker, but how will this actually impact lives? And so it's just been lovely to talk with you guys today. And thank you for the time. Thank you for the opportunity.
And I know everyone joins me in thanking you for taking the time to chat with us. And also we thank you for your dedication to public service on behalf of our state and our communities. We certainly appreciate the opportunity to visit with you today and hope you'll be willing to chat with us again in the not too distant future, maybe even in person.
I would look forward to it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, guys.
Okay. Well, this concludes our program. Thank you everyone for attending, and you'll be getting more information about future programs.